皆さんこんにちは。そろそろ午後の部を始めさせていただきたいと思います。Good afternoon, everybody. Let us resume this session in the afternoon. 午後の部はこのお手元のプログラムをご覧にいただけますとお分かりになりますように、プログラムございますか。私は午後の部の司会を仰せつかっております神戸大学の由井と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。午後の部は4人のスピーカー、報告者の方をお願いしておりまして、基本的なフレームは午前と同じでして、それぞれの方に15分ずつの報告をお願いをして、その後10分間のごく簡単な質問の時間を受け付けまして、全体として、もしも私の司会の適用が良ければ30分ぐらいの全体討論の時間があるだろうということでございますが、私自身の経験からするとなかなかそういうわけにはいきませんので、その場合にはベルント先生がここにおられますので、私が変な道へ入ろうとしたら正しい道に戻していただけるだろうというふうに思って、ベルント先生だけが頼りでございますので、皆さんどうぞご協力のほどお願いをいたします。
責任が回されちゃった。そうですね。A few words in English. We are going to proceed the same way as during the morning session. 15 minutes per talk, 10 minutes of Q&A shortly after. As you can see from the program, a final discussion is scheduled at the end. But according to my experiences, it's difficult to keep that schedule. So please be tolerant and patient. If necessary, we might take a little bit more time for the discussion and make the final discussion shorter.
Let's do this. Yeah. Make it shorter.
よろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。それと強調しておきたいのはそれぞれの報告の後の10分ですが、くれぐれも簡単な質問に限定を事実確認の質問に限定をしていただきたいと思います。I would like to emphasize that the 10 minutes Q&A period should be on the very minor questions to clarify the facts. Only that range, please. では始めましょう。それではですね、まず第一に、ベネチア大学の三宅俊夫先生にご登壇をいただきまして、サブカルチャーとしての日本研究ということでご報告をいただきたいと思います。So, Professor Miyake, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for coming to listen to this panel. I would like to thank the organizers, Professor Yuki Omitsu and Professor Jacqueline Band, for giving me the opportunity to participate at such an interesting conference. My presentation today acknowledges the growing interest in the last decades regarding Japanese popular cultures outside Japan, and is mainly inspired by the following question. What are the structural or positional conditions wherein the encounter between Japanese studies and Japanese popular cultures is taking place in terms of culture, identity, and power relations? To address this question, I would like to focus on the notion of what I call interrelationality. This notion comes from my reading of Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony, even if Gramsci himself did not use the term interrelationality. Despite common sense, hegemony is not equivalent to simple cultural domination, but is not only limited to some more complex articulation of power exercised by the bourgeois class upon the working classes. Besides historical contextualization according to specific socio-economic conditions, hegemony as an unstable balance of coercion and consent is most effective and proportional to the active consent coming from subaltern social groups, interrelated to the economical, political, and social order exercised by ruling social groups. In other words, the point that I would like to stress is that there can be no effective hegemony without the active involvement and participation of the subaltern sides. While Gramsci elaborated his notion of hegemony by focusing mainly on social groups within modern nation-states from the 19th to the early 20th century in Italy, he extended this notion also to a global scale. As far as I know, Gramsci has been the first to critically elaborate on the arbitrary notions of the so-called West and the so-called East, as well as suggesting their concrete effectiveness as modern world hegemony. An Eurocentric imagined geography which relies on the interiorization and active reproduction of the subaltern rest of the world as East, self-orientalism, including Japan as so-called Far East. Actually, Gramsci did not use either terms like Occidentalism, Orientalism, or self-orientalism, but by focusing on the interrelational process of hegemony, it allows us to avoid one-sided or monological perspectives, and especially to pay attention to neglected and intertwined issues of culture, identity, and power. For instance, why should the subaltern side, even against its own fundamental interest, adhere actively to a hegemonic order, guaranteeing the latter's effectiveness and reproduction? In this sense, a preliminary question to pose is, what are the strategic advantages for a subaltern side that a specific social cultural order, an institution or a group is able to offer, to activate, to mobilize in order to articulate its effective hegemony? So in regards to Japanese studies and its marginalization, interrelated to the wider hegemonic academic field or within a given university, the question to pose is, what advantages may this kind of confinement offer? This means not only as usual to pay attention to marginalization or confinement from above, but also to advantages offered by active marginalization from below, resulting eventually in strategic self-confinement and self-marginalization. To put it in other words, what kind of cultural and symbolic capital does hegemonic marginalization interrelated to self-marginalization offer for Japanese studies? The same question may apply to urban subcultures in regards to the wider social-cultural order of a given society. What kind of subcultural capital is relevant? What kind of advantages are offered, articulated or aimed at, resulting in self-marginalization interrelated to wider hegemonic process? Now, in order to address these issues, I would like to refer to the situation in my university of affiliation, Ca' Foscari University of Venice, within the context of contemporary Italy. Italy is actually the country where I've been grown up since early childhood and where I've studied Japanese as a foreign language at Ca' Foscari University. At present, Ca' Foscari has about 1,370 students enrolled for a degree in Japanese studies throughout undergraduate, postgraduate, graduate and PhD courses at the Department of Asian and North African Studies. This makes Japanese studies at Ca' Foscari the first in Italy and arguably in whole Europe, at least as in terms of students' number. Despite the declining potential of a degree in Japanese studies in regards to job opportunities, one reason of this large and constantly growing number of students is the recognition of being Ca' Foscari the best place to study Japan in Italy. This is due mainly to heavy emphasis on Japanese language education, but also due to strong publication records in the fields of Japanese literature, religion, art, and history, at least in Italian. But a more important reason is the widespread popularity of Japanese popular cultures. Surveys on first-year students show that the overwhelming majority is motivated to study Japan due to interest in anime, manga, youth subcultures, and so forth. According to Marco Pellitteri, Italy holds the world record of being the country with the highest number of anime series broadcast on television outside Japan since the late 1970s. So it is safe to say that at present almost all Italians below 40 years have been completely immersed and enculturated in a transmedial environment, animated by the constellation of Japanese popular cultures. So, what happens when widespread desire for Japanese popular cultures meet academic Japanese studies? Actually, at present, there is no monograph written by an Italian tenured Japanologist, besides a short history on manga focusing mainly on pre-war manga. And there is no class or course on Japanese popular cultures taught by a tenured professor. On the contrary, there is an amazing amount of publications comprising more than 100 volumes written by non-Japanologists, about every imaginable aspect of Japanese popular cultures. In other words, the encounter between Japanese studies and Japanese popular cultures proves to be very difficult and ambivalent. During a PhD seminar discussion last February at my department, Attilio Andreini, a sinologist, referred very interesting to a strategical aspect in reproducing Orientalism and cultural essentialism, a vital necessity in order for Chinese studies and in general for East Asian studies in our university to survive. He was pointing to the risk of Chinese, Japanese or Korean courses from being dissected and absorbed by more powerful departments like economy, resulting in the loss of autonomy, control and integrity of our department. Now, one historical raison d'etre of area studies, including Japanese studies, at least in Europe, has been monopoly of language knowledge as the key to understand texts. And texts, especially classical and pre-modern texts, as a key to understand cultures and civilizations, contributing to culturalistic approaches applied to regions or nations, including the history, politics, economy, society, and people. As Steffi Richter of Leipzig University has suggested, methodological nationalism has been the essentialized, aestheticized, and elitist framework of past Japanese studies within the process of the modern nation-state building, both on the side of European Japanologists as well as on the side of national culture formation in modern Japan, such as the post-war Nihonjinron discourses. In my perspective, linguistic and cultural essentialism combined with insistence on some classical or pre-modern value, such as mononaware, Zen, Bushido, harmony, and so forth, has been strategical in the past to the distinction of Japanese studies, both in terms of identitary recognition as separated academic field, as well as in terms of legitimacy of its essentialized content as a deep, difficult, and unique culture, a mysterious and sophisticated culture which may be understood and explained only by the Japanologist expert. This contributes to the reluctance to introduce critical theory, social sciences, and media studies within Japanese studies. And it contributes also to the difficulty to deal with contemporary popular cultures, which according to past or modernist standards of evaluation can't be nothing more than superficial, commercial, consumerist, infantile, and so forth. Cultural essentialism has been widely deconstructed and delegitimized worldwide, at least on the theoretical or academic level, including Italy, which is the country not only of Antonio Gramsci, but also of Umberto Eco, Toni Negri, and Giorgio Agamben, all influential figures of critical theory. And more generally, globalization, regionalism, and new media enculturation consumption are eroding the historical context of modern nation-based identity and othering politics. But within neoliberal reforms of the academic world, stressing cultural, national, or civilizational uniqueness is becoming not a matter of the scholar's personal and theoretical conviction. Strategical Orientalism has become a competitive value-added resource in the university, and a defining cultural capital in terms of visibility and legitimacy in relation to extra-academic field of the publishing world and the public opinion. Very interesting, the same kind of strategical Orientalism or strategical essentialism is reproduced also from below among students of Japanese studies, and especially among the wide Italian fandom of Japanese popular cultures. On the one hand, Japanese popular cultures such as anime, video games, toys, in contrast to traditional Japanese cultures, are extensively absorbed since early childhood for fun and entertaining value, without any recognition or preoccupation of being Japanese. And as Iwabuchi Koichi has suggested, they are appreciated as odorless commodities without ethnic or national connotations. In this sense, they are by no way subcultural or marginal, but already popular ingredients of a wider and globalized mediascape. On the other hand, students motivated in the first year by burning passion for Japanese popular cultures end up with the conviction that the object of passion is no culture at all. It is only infantile hobby that the academic study has helped to overcome. And finally, very few may persist within widespread ostracism from their peers by graduating with an MA thesis on Zen in anime or other deep meanings and aesthetic values in manga, video games, and youth subcultures. Even more interesting, most of the hardcore fandom outside the university aims for strategical differentiation of themselves by re-enchanting or re-odorizing Japanese popular cultures. For instance, the two main themes of the hundreds of publications on anime by non-Japanologists are: first, dualistic configuration of Japanese anime as the East versus Walt Disney Animation as the West. Second, heated criticism against Italian television editors for censor and disregard of the linguistic, cultural, and presumed pure essence of the original Japanese anime. Subcultural distinction and subcultural capital against the dominant and supposed ignorant mainstream is mostly assured and profitable, as in past Japanese studies, by boasting about deep knowledge of Japan in terms of linguistic competence or of familiarity with some Eastern values antithetical to Western values. In other words, the fields of Japanese studies and subcultural appropriation of Japanese popular cultures share a positional analogy. They both share structural conditions where strategical Orientalism and self-confinement, interrelated to the hegemonic academic or social order, configure the encounter with Japanese popular cultures, at least in contemporary Italy. Of course, there are many different situations. One very interesting case is the emerging growth of boys' love and yaoi fandom in Italy, resulting in publications of original yaoi works by Italian women authors quite unconcerned of Japanese order or Japaneseness. This is because the publishing house, Tech Editori, promoting Italian yaoi works, strategically employs cross-gendered, romanticized and pornographic affect inspired by yaoi manga and cosplay for socially engaged agenda against homophobic and misogynist discrimination in Italy. This brings me to the concluding remarks or questions, which hopefully may be relevant also for different national contexts. First, besides critical investigation of often overtly enthusiastic encounters between Japanese studies in Euro-American universities and Japanese popular cultures, one important issue is to single out what kind of structural condition could be more effective in order to avoid strategical Orientalism and self-confinement. How can we contribute as scholars and teachers to actively create the conditions where adopting a transnational, transcultural, and transdisciplinary approach becomes a strategical and tangible advantage? Second, the same issue may apply also to the Japanese context itself as in regards to the interplay between academic order and Japanese studies on the one hand, and society and subcultures on the other. But from my interrelational perspective, a very crucial aspect of Japanese studies in Japan is 1. Governmental involvement in framing both Japanese studies and popular cultures according to national identity politics. 2. The way of how these national identity politics may resort to collaboration by Euro-American and Asian scholars as a kind of legitimizing Western or international gaze. So the self-reflexive issue would be: what kind of strategical advantages are involved in the implementation of international Japanese studies, Kokusai Nihon Kenkyu, fostered by the government, combined with nation branding of popular cultures, subcultures, according to cool Japan policies? Are they both contributing again to reproduction of methodological nationalism and self-confinement activated by Japanese studies, as well as to self-Orientalism in Japan, interrelated to hegemony of neo-Orientalism in Euro-American contexts? Thank you very much for your kind attention.
どうもありがとうございました、宮城先生。通訳の、装置が皆さんのところにあると思いますので、日本語から英語への、通訳が必要になる方はそれを利用していただきたいと思います。大変面白い議論ありがとうございました。それでは最初に申しましたように10分間の簡単な質問の時間を設けたいと思いますので、 Now it's open for the 10 minutes. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. じゃあまず英語で聞きますけど、
少しずつ切ってお願いします。通訳のために。
Okay, I agree. It's very interesting, and I think you're right. There's a self-confinement in Japan studies that we need to fight. まあ、とりあえず、まあ、賛成します。どっちかというと、その学者の、大丈夫です。自分で
You are doing self-interpretation. Self-translate. Okay. Yes.
That's
Please
okay.
do. Please do. Yes.
うん、大体賛
To
成
save
します
time.。
学者で、やっぱり日本スタディーズ、ジャパンスタディーズの中では、まあ、自分の、まあ、箱を作って、なんかこれ小さいことしか、研究しない方が多いですし、問題だと思います。その辺がすごく賛成します。So I agree with this problem of self-confinement. My question is, though, isn't that true of all academia, right? That when we say rigorous academic work, we define a small area of study, and that and maybe that's what distinguishes academic work from popular work, which floats from Bushido to anime very simply, and without questioning the historical differences. まあ、どう説明したらいいかな。まあ、学者の仕事として、その小さいものを研究しないと、まあ、真面目な学者じゃないという意見がすぐ出てくると思うし、もちろんそのストラクチャラルコンディションによって、多分あると思いますけど、でも、だったら、どうしたらいいでしょうか。ちょっと疑問。もう聞きたいです。
Sorry, I will answer in English. I agree with you, of course. Academic work is a lot about specialization, specialized knowledge. But I think there's a big difference if we, for example, compare Japanese studies with scientific academic fields. For example, I'm coming from a family of biologists, scientists. Of course, they have their own object of study, but they study it with an international community. Okay.
はい。そうですね。おっしゃる通り、まあ、アカデミシャンというのはその細かいところに、閉じこもってしまうという傾向があるというのは確かにその通りだと思います。で、まあ、どうすればいいかという話なんですけど、ジャパニーズ日本学ですねを例えば科学系の学問と比べてみたいと思います。私自身はその、家庭としてですね生物系の学者の家で、生まれて育ったわけなんですけども、彼らというのは当然それぞれ専門の、細かな専門性を持っているわけですが、にもかかわらず、国際的な、コミュニティの中で、研究を行っているという実情があります。
Yes, I'm not saying that we must follow the scientists, but I think there are many different ways of communicating, collaborating, and dealing with very small issues. Actually, Japanese studies is not only that there's a self-confinement, how you say, an abstract self-confinement. It's a very national-based self-confinement. So, for example, one interesting structure is that Italian scholars of Japanese studies would go to Japan and will say what the situation is of Japanese studies in Italy. And from Japan, they will come to Italy and say the same. It's yes, yes, but that they're reciprocal. There's a complicity. They mutually enforce each other. And actually, yes, I would like to go further from this enclosement and to see where the advantages are, because it's not because people are stupid, they're essentialistic, old-fashioned, and so on. Actually, most of them, they don't think about this, but they are very, very, very clever. I mean, theoretically also, but there are real structural advantages to do it in this way. That's my point.
先ほどのその科学的というサイエンティストのたどった道と同じような道を必ずしもたどる必要はないわけなんですけども、例えばですね日本学あるいはカルチャルスタディーズ関係がその協力したりコミュニケートする方法というのはまだいくつかあると思います。例えばですね、私はそのイタリアでそのジャパノロジーの研究している状況を日本に来て報告したりとかですね、または逆に日本の状況を向こうで知らせたりとか、そういうコミュニケーションの仕方はあると思います。
じゃあ日本学をやめた方がいいですか？ So should we? No. What is your suggestion?
No.
Should we quit Japanese studies and just shift to? You said departments of economics or media. So what is your?
I think there are third ways, fourth ways. I mean, you can of course deal with the Japanese studies, but what I would like to say is that I'm critical for the old structures. That you do only this and you're not able to relate to other academic fields, and you're not able, as we have spoken about this, to relate also to the wider society. I mean, the civil society, and also to the market. Often, so I think it's an open question, of course.
もちろんやめるということではなくてですね、それは私が、批評しているのはむしろその古い形での制度で行われている、ジャパノロジーについての話で、もっと開かれた形で、学者だけではなく、一般の人に向けてあるとか、そういうことをさらに進めていくということを私は望んでいます。
他に簡単な質問ですがございますでしょうか。あと5分ございます。はい。
I guess maybe this is just also more of a comment, but in some ways I think a lot of Japan studies is relating to other fields right now, and maybe this is the difference between Italy and maybe there's a kind of interiorization. Yes, I write grants and say I'm going to do the study of X in Japan, but I'm in a film studies program and I articulate it through the language of film or media studies. Ian comes from anthropology, but he, I think, articulates it in a more transnational context. So I guess I'm wondering, is it a transmedia, or I guess I didn't mean transmedia, a transdisciplinary approach that you're hoping for, and that by talking with different disciplines you get out of the national perspective, or would you rather that we don't study the object of a nation?
Do you like self-interpretation or you trust the...
Maybe someone can interpret for me, please. お願いします。
もちろん国によってイタリアの話をされてたので国によって違うところはあるんですけども、実際あなたが望まれているのは例えば分野両断的なものを望まれているのか、それとも、いわゆる国ナショナリズムの観点からそういう視点の研究というのを否定されているのか、実際のところどうなんでしょうか。
Okay, thank you for the question because it gives me the possibility to clarify my point. I was speaking especially not only of Italy but of the European situation. Of course, Europe is called more Japanology, and I think you're coming from a North American context. Maybe it's a little bit different, as you know. And actually, it's not only that Japanese studies or area studies is very confined, but also the other disciplines are very confined. So it's about different academic fields who are competing and self-confining and looking for resources. It's, I think, different than in the States or in Canada, I guess. Yes, I would be happy with an interdisciplinary approach. This would be, or even one disciplinary approach, because if you speak about area studies, what is the disciplinary status of area studies? We know.
そうですね。もう少しクリアに話を、してみると、おっしゃるとおり私が話しているのは、イタリアというよりはむしろヨーロッパについての状況で、それはおそらく、あなたは、北米の方から来られているんだと思いますけれども、状況がまた違うんだと思います。ヨーロッパの場合は各分野領域というのがかなり、それぞれ限定されたものとして確立されていて、お互いの領域を侵さないという現状があります。で、それはアメリカあるいはカナダ、北米についてと違うところだと思います。で、分野両断的という話でしたけども、完全に分野を横断してしまう、分野を破壊してしまうようなことではなくて、ことでは意味がないというふうには考えております。
はい、どうもありがとうございました。あと2、3人いてもうそれで終わりにしたいと思います。2人 ?3 人 ?1 人 ?Yeah, yes, Colombia。 最後にジェネラルディスカッションで、全体討論でじゃあお願いいたします。
Toshio, could you talk a bit about how, I mean, you talk about the Italian context, but of course this is in the broader European context, and the building of a European identity that is beyond simply an Italian one, which plays a role in strengthening the idea of a Europe. And with a Europe, of course, if you take your perspective of interrelationality, there has to be an outside of Europe, which then becomes the Orient, and then Japan becomes part of that. So how much of what you're discussing is outside of the academic environment, the construction of a European project that searches for something beyond an Italian national identity, and that then constructs a European identity, and that cannot be constructed itself without an outside. And Japan is part of that outside. So that kind of Orientalism or Neo-Orientalism is strategic not only within the, let's say, the university context, but within the kind of pan-European identitarian project. And
すみません、ちょっと長いんですが、お願いいたします。
はい、先ほどそのイタリアのみならず、ヨーロッパという話をされましたけども、その時のその、それぞれのアイデンティティですね、イタリア国としてのアイデンティティ、それ、を超えて、次の段階で、ヨーロッパというアイデンティティがあると。で、それに対して、それに対するものとしてオリエンタルというまた別のアイデンティティがあるという、現状があると思うんですけれども、それについてはどうお考えでしょうか。はい。
そうですね。はい、お願いします。
Okay, thank you. This is a very interesting and also difficult question because there are two different levels who are intersecting the national level and the continental level. And actually, for me, I'm very personally involved because my actual research funding is coming from Europe. I'm a researcher funded by the European Commission, Marie Curie International Incoming Fellow. And actually, I proposed a very critical, theoretical project about Orientalism, Occidentalism, and so on, and they accepted it. But I think that at this level, the funding of research by the European Commission related, of course, to issues of European identity. I spoke about European identity in my research proposal. Is more open because it's more an open question. It's more contested, I think, speaking about European identity. While when we move to a more national context like Italy and how their respective academic fields are now constructed, it has a very old history and it's more hard. So now there are different levels who are, of course, intersecting, yes.
Okay. はい、質問まだ終わりかもしれませんけれども、最後の全体討論のところへ回していただいて、三宅先生のお話はこれでその質問も含めまして終わりにしたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。Please interpret my announcement.
すみません、最後の回答なんですけども、それは、実際、現実の問題もあって、私自身はそのヨーロッパの研究基金というのをもらって研究しているので、その自分の研究テーマを説明するときに、やはりヨーロッパのアイデンティティということが、最初に来ます。で、その時に例えばイタリアであるとか、それぞれ国のアイデンティティの話をすると、非常に微妙な問題になるので、そこは話としていろいろなレベルがあるということです。
はい、どうもありがとうございました。失礼しました。もう一度大きな拍手をお願いいたします。三宅先生、どうもありがとうございました。それでは